Hey everybody, I'm going to try today to see if I can get my Castify and our internet to be friends. So we're going to talk about blood today. This will be a fairly short presentation. We're going to talk about the structure and function of blood. It's another important part of the cardiovascular system. When you take anatomy, you'll learn a lot more about it, but this will give you some basics. So the composition of blood's responsible for, and you need to remember, oxygen or gas transportation, oxygen and carbon dioxide. It's responsible for transporting waste products, nutrients, and then helping remove toxins for the body. So blood is part of our transport system. It gets all of the things we need for cells and the rest of our body to live, and it takes away things that would harm it. So it's our part of our transport system. Blood makes up only about 6 or 8% of our body weight. And a normal adult has about 5 liters of blood, 5 to 6 liters, depending on male, female, height, size, those kind of things. But if you guys remember back to first aid, if you lose only 1 liter, you potentially can go into hypovolemic shock and die. So we have to think about that we need at least 4 liters of blood constantly circulating to survive. Blood is made up of cellular material and fluid called plasma. So it has red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, and plasma. So we're going to talk about each one of those. But remember that blood is made of plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Red blood cells I'll refer to as erythrocytes. White blood cells I'll refer to as leukocytes, and platelets I'll refer to as thrombocytes. Those are the medical terms for the parts of blood. So red blood cells are erythrocytes, white blood cells are leukocytes, and platelets are thrombocytes. The cells are also suspended in plasma. And I wish I still had some, I don't. My medical assistant students drew some blood, and we actually spun it down so they could see blood as it separates. When you spin blood down for lab testing in a centrifuge, plasma floats to the top, and all of the cells will float to the bottom. They do the same thing if you donate blood. So we're going to talk about blood formation. I'm going to make it much more simple than this, so you guys please listen and take notes over what I'm telling you. I do want you to know that hematopoiesis means, that's a medical term for blood formation. Hematopoiesis is the term for blood formation or blood generation. In adults and in children, our bone marrow is where we get our blood cells. Now, in adults, bone marrow is basically in our flat bones, but in kids under the age of probably 11 or 12, they also have bone marrow in their long bones. As we age, if you remember back to when we talked about bones, the marrow in those long bones becomes yellow marrow, or it's a fat storage. Blood cells need certain nutrients to form properly. So remember that for blood to form properly, we have to have the right iron level, folic acid level, and B12 level. Those are very important for blood formation at any age. So people that have any type of anemia, generally they're lacking either iron, folic acid, or B12. It's also why folic acid is very important during pregnancy, because we have to have extra blood to circulate, and the baby has to make blood. Blood cells come from specific, and I want you to just know, blood cells start from stem cells, and then they differentiate out. You don't have to know that little image on the right, but just know that all blood cells start as a stem cell, and then they differentiate depending on what kind of blood cell they're going to become. Composition of blood. Blood is about 55% plasma, and then about 45% of the remaining parts of blood. Plasma is 90% water, so remember, plasma makes up over half of 55% of blood. 90% of that plasma is water, which is why it's so important for us to stay hydrated and drink plenty of water. It has 10% proteins, lipids, carbohydrates. So only 10% of plasma is all the other things. Waste, ions like potassium and calcium, salts, electrolytes, other hormones, antibodies, and amino acids. So what I want you to remember about plasma is it is 90% water and 10% everything else. The remaining 45% is mostly red blood cells, and less than 1% would be white blood cells and platelets. So remember that most of our blood is either plasma or red blood cells, and then a very small portion, less than 1%, would be our white blood cells and our platelets. So you guys be sure you remember that picture on the right, okay? Each type performs a different function. Red blood cells help us circulate oxygen and iron in the body. White blood cells help us fight off infection, and thrombocytes or platelets help clots. We're going to talk about each one of those. And I'm going to tell you what I want you to know off of these slides. So I want you to remember that red blood cells are the most abundant. They're the largest portion of our blood cells. Red blood cells are the largest portion of our blood cells. They're formed in marrow. They are what we call biconcave disc, which means they're circular with a dent in the top and the bottom. They have no nucleus. So you need to remember that they're biconcaved in shape. They have no nucleus, and they're formed in blood marrow. That they carry oxygen and iron around in the body, and that they live about 120 days. So remember that they are the largest number of cells in our body. They are formed from bone marrow. They have no nucleus. They are biconcave disc, or circular with two dents in the top and the bottom. They live about 120 days, and they carry our oxygen and our iron around in our body. Okay, so that's what I want you to remember about red blood cells. White blood cells, or leukocytes, I want you to remember that they are the largest size blood. They're the biggest cell. They're the biggest blood cell in size. They are also formed in bone marrow, but some of them, lymphocytes, are actually formed not necessarily in bone marrow. Some parts are formed in our lymph glands. So our lymphocytes are formed in lymph glands. That they are the primary cells of our immune system. They make up most of the immunities in our body. They do have a nucleus. Sorry, guys. And must replicate that way. And they live anywhere from 24 hours to several years. Now, what I want you to remember about why they live so long, or what I want you to remember about their lifespan, is some of our white blood cells are floating around looking to fight things off all the time, and they're used up when they're fighting off our everyday organisms that attack our body. Other cells live for a really long time, like when we get a vaccine, we build memory cells, and those memory cells are specific to fighting off a certain type of infection or a certain type of disease process, like it may be a certain type of cell that's specifically going to fight off measles. So those would live longer than maybe a monocyte that's just out there working around to fight off any type of infection. Remember that there are 5 types of white blood cells. There are neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes. So be sure you remember those 5 types of cells. Remember the lifespan. Remember that they do have a nucleus and that contains DNA. And remember they are the largest size. They're the biggest size blood cell. Okay? Remember that. So, and remember those things about leukocytes, or white blood cells. Platelets, what I want you to remember about platelets is platelets are also formed in bone marrow. That's going to be an across the board. All of the cells are formed in bone marrow. They are the smallest blood cells, and their job is to form clots, and they only live 8 to 12 days. Because we injure our body a lot. We bump into things, we work out, we do things that injure our body. And so they have to replicate much faster. So remember that platelets they're the smallest cells. They form in bone marrow, and they're what help us make clot. They have multiple shapes. And remember, they have multiple different shapes. They live 8 to 12 days. Okay, so I've already talked about this. Platelets help repair vessel damage, they seal wounds, and they form clots so that we can start that healing process when we have some kind of injury. That's what I want you to remember. The rest of what I want you to remember about platelets. Okay, guys, that is it about blood. Be sure you go back. You have good notes over this because you're going to have a study guide on Monday, or you're going to have a study guide in next class, not necessarily Monday, but in your next class. And then you're going to have a test next week over this. So be sure that you have good notes over this so you can do your study guide, okay? All right. Thanks, everybody. I will talk to you soon.